Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and we're not feeding today. Today I think I've just got one task that I want to accomplish, and that's going to be to check in on one of my bins which I skipped feeding most recently. It's the one down here on the bottom. It's not a very old bin. It's 52 days old now, and it was 10 days ago and it was still only 42 days old that I had administered the last feeding to that bin. And at that time, I distinctly remember even making a comment not too long ago when I was talking about these three bins here. It was that, these bins are so heavily populated that waiting more than a week between check-ins on this could be a mistake because they would just deplete their food. And, within 10 days' time, it is best to replenish their food supply so as to not allow it to run out. So since we had already gone down the road of skipping the last feeding on this one, we're now 10 days since it was set to starve. And I do recall there being a few items in there that might be very slow composting types of items. And if they're still in there, then one thing I would definitely want to do is remove those things. And then hopefully the worms will focus their energy on any remaining food scraps and bedding and really turn everything to compost without any sort of distraction from any sort of larger food objects that might still be floating around in the bin. So all we're doing today is checking in. Hopefully everything's fine. If there's anything we could do to help steer it towards completion more quickly, we'll do that. So let's get it up on the bench and see how things are looking. Now, should we arrive at the point where we're going to want to extract anything from the bin, and I know we will, got this little tray here that we could place things into. And anything that we've collected, we're just going to place that into the newest of my bins. That'll give it plenty of time to continue breaking down, because I think the days are numbered for this bin. Here's another one. The worms seem pretty at home here on the top surface. This piece of paper, having been here for 10 days, wouldn't have been placed here with any of these castings on it. It would have been a sheet of paper, and it's almost at a point where it's buried under castings. So this is all evidence of worm traffic. It's interesting that they're not really doing much to break the paper down too much. I'm sure they're chewing away at it, but there is still a fair amount of it here still. This piece of paper, I think was such that I was able to lift it up in two separate pieces when we positioned it here last time, and I think it's already maybe 10 separate fragments that I've removed from the feeding zone area, not to mention lots of little tiny scraps. So that piece of paper is more or less bedding at this point. The material is definitely drying out nicely, despite the plastic covering, which is keeping the moisture pretty much perfect. I think if it's too damp, you don't have this really loose, fine, crumbly type of collection of castings. You find that your castings sort of stick together a little bit and get muddy. But here, the moisture level seems to be perfect. It's allowing the castings to all remain loosely individual little fragments of worm manure, and this stuff would just go right through a sifter if you were to start piling all this in, and you'd be able to separate all this large uncomposted leaf matter and whatnot pretty quickly. So that's pretty neat, and it's an interesting option to consider, because usually I'm a little bit deterred by the prospect of sifting, because if the material is very damp and clumpy, then it's not going to pass through the sifter. And what you're really ending up with is just mounds and mounds of compost that's really just stuck to itself. And you sort of disqualify it as uncomposted material since it didn't pass through the screen. And it's a little bit of a waste of time. I'm definitely seeing bits of the bedding that was used beneath the feeding zone last time. These are fragments of egg carton. Not the type of bedding I use very often. I usually use corrugated cardboard. Just seems to be what I have in abundance of around here, but I had a few egg cartons piling up, so I figured I'd use that as our bedding here. All right, we've got ourselves the stem of a tiny pumpkin that was the featured subject of a time-lapse video. It's pretty cool how you can really just squish the pumpkin stem. I can almost crack it with my thumb if I wanted to. But it's one of the large slow composting items that I'm setting aside, obviously, along with these 2 mango seeds. I think if we're going to expect to see this bin fully completed, any large objects, here's a banana peel stem. This is pretty wild looking. I believe that this is the skin of a cantaloupe rind, and they've picked out all of the softer portions of it, leaving the more woody, harder web kind of structure that the cantaloupe has on the outside. So amazing how they pick off every little bit that they can. And eventually they'll get to this too, but until they can, it remains uneaten. But it'll get there eventually. So I think all this bedding, this bedding is hopefully what I'd like them to start seeing as their primary food source. So this will all stay, but like a large double stem of banana peel, along with these other larger objects. I think I'm going to be extracting all those. What else can we find? Another mango pit, but this one's much further along. Definitely not going to be done in the next few days or weeks, so I'm just treating it as large, slow composting stuff to be extracted. Now, we only fed down the middle in this bin, so we really shouldn't expect to find food fragments anywhere else. I think as far as finding large food fragments to extract, we've pretty much accomplished that portion of the mission. And I believe that what's left in here, all these fragments of cardboard, all of them soaked with whatever fruits and veggies were added in here as feedings previously, they're all completely edible from the point of view of the worm. And in order for that to become an interesting food option, you would need all the other stuff that's in here to be gone first. All of the more delicious banana peels, or at least the stems of banana peels, where you could see 2 little worms partying inside of it. I'm taking all that stuff out. If I could find a piece that's as big as a banana peel stem, or obviously a mango seed, I'm going to pull it out. We're going to place that into the newest of my bins so that it can continue breaking down. And hopefully from that point forward, the inhabitants of this bin will turn their attentions to what remains, which is mainly bedding at this point, cardboard fragments for the most part. Another thing in my bins that often takes a little bit of time to break down are the stems of leaves. But even here we've got the leafy matter, which is still perfectly edible, perfectly good food source for them. And that's the stuff that I'd prefer to see them working on at this point. Man, this material is so nice. Just the way it flakes apart in your hands. It's completely loaded with worms. Every square inch just has dozens and dozens of worms in it. All right, I think at this point we've more or less deprived them of any other large chunks of food in here. We've confirmed that they've certainly got an abundance of bedding type material so that they could turn their feeding efforts to that from this point forward. The moisture level I'm not concerned about. It seems to be pretty much perfect. It's nice and damp, so there's worms everywhere, very cozy and comfortable for them. But it's not so damp that it makes the material all stick together, so it's, like I said, perfect almost. Not sure what this is. I think it's a piece of orange. Definitely a slow composting thing. Usually a no-no as far as worm bins are concerned, but in small small amounts, I believe things like that don't have any sort of a negative effect on the bin. I think the main concern with stuff like that is that it's a little bit high in acid. But if it's a piece that's that small, the other creatures in the bin will break it down to a certain point at which the worms can make use of it without it being any sort of a problem. Look at this material. I'm always curious to see if the level is going to drop from all this large chunk material getting broken down. But even if it did drop, I don't think it would drop by much and it wouldn't help us. We're still in an overloaded, at capacity sort of a situation here in this bin. So I think it is just a good thing to be removing stuff at this point and giving ourselves just a little bit more room in here. So besides these large food fragments, the seeds, the stems, the more woody types of objects, I believe the other stuff that's going to be easy to extract at this point is going to be a lot of this leafy material floating around on the top, like so. And you know what? I was looking at all of this paper here thinking to myself, do I extract this too, or do I leave it? And you know what? I've made the decision that it's coming out too. Because why would I want them spending time eating this stuff when I really want them working down whatever remains down in here? I wonder how long it'll take. I think we did a pretty good job extracting all of the largest objects, leaving only the smallest stuff behind. I'm making my way now out to the outer edges. We did a pretty good examination of the middle, taking out any sort of food that we could. But even when I go out to the edges, I'm so used to expecting to find out here on the edges very dry stuff and a material that's void of worms, but what I really find out here is material that's almost even more damp than where the feeding was occurring, and it's totally jammed with worms and totally moist and comfortable. And guess what I'm finding here? Tons and tons of additional leaves. I think this bin is still pretty much loaded with all kinds of bedding. It's all leaves and stems of leaves, and tons of worms hanging out in it. I'm gonna go down deep on a couple other corners now, because we didn't go very deep over here. We just did a little skim across the top, and I didn't realize there was still this much stuff in here. And I'm not gonna go picking out a whole bunch of bedding off the bottom of the bin. That stuff's just going to have to stay, and whatever time it takes for that stuff to break down is what it's going to take. Here too, if I go down deep, I'm pulling up lots of beautiful castings. It's everywhere, along with tons of worms. But scattered throughout it is still large fragments of leaves and their stems. But it's not being neglected, that's for sure. Everywhere you see worms working the stuff. And the moisture level seems perfect too. So I really have no concern with regards to moisture. I don't really have any concerns about food either. Even though we took all of this out, I think there's still just as much, if not more, food remaining in here. And it makes me wonder how long it'll take. You know, you could tell it's a very heavily populated bin, but now that we've taken a lot of the, larger, more concentrated food substances out, and all that remains is some really small stuff, even though it's a lot of it. It makes me wonder, how long will it take for this stuff to break down? It's kind of like a little leapfrog approach, I suppose, right? As you put in your normal feedings up until a certain point, and if certain things just don't get very far, then you leapfrog this stuff over into another bin that's got a pretty good chance of being around for a lot longer. Because I believe something like this is really staged for a good quick finish, with so many worms in it, with the material and the environment just being so, or at least seemingly so perfect for the worms. I can only imagine that they just keep going at it. Let's see what we find down here. I see a lot more leaf stems, chunks of leaves, clearly. Not sure if some of this is big enough still and still far enough from being partially broken down that it might be worth extracting it. I don't want to go down that road. I really don't want to start into that. If that just adds another day or two to the process, so be it. I still think we're doing a tremendous thing here to help the bin finish by doing this. And it's also just fun. It's fun to see how the bin's doing, because the bin really is among my best bins. And I think it's got so much to do with the way the moisture is being retained within the material. I've never tried using plastic sheets like you saw in the beginning, which I took off in the very start. And ever since I've been using them, the moisture in the bins has been absolutely perfect. More large chunks of leaves, but let's leave them. There was just this one thing that I found. It was just another portion of the pumpkin stem. And this was actually the part of the stem which I had chopped off when I started the video of the pumpkin time lapse. The pumpkin had a much taller, much larger stem, and I had gone and sawed off this other segment of it. So while the main part of it with the base is still intact for the most part, definitely getting soft and hollowed out, the more narrow end of the stem is definitely getting worked on here. The worms are burrowing into the middle of it and chewing it out from the inside. Pretty cool to see. Oh, so soft. You can see all the individual fibers of the material in here. Let's get these guys back. Oh, you know what do I do? I guess we're probably best off sticking to our original rule here, is denying these little guys this meal. This guy's kind of inserted himself into the material. I'm going to treat this as slow composting stuff that comes out as well. And even though at some point we're probably not going to recognize that as the pumpkin stem anymore, let's keep it right there with the pumpkin stem. Alright, so that's cool. I'm glad we found that and extracted it too. At this point I'm definitely feeling like we've got ourselves a batch of material here that's destined to become beautiful finished compost in a very short period of time. I just wonder how long it'll be. If you have any estimates based on what we've seen here together, then I'd be interested in hearing it. You'll be able to see exactly how I leave it when I put it all back together and return it to the shelf, so you'll know that it's going to be reset just the way it was, with the same plastic coverings to keep moisture in, etc., so on. And as long as that moisture keeps recirculating within this bin the way it always has, I think this material is going to stay just as damp and moist and comfortable for them, encouraging them to continue cruising around the surface all over the place. Where'd this guy come from? Alright, I'm going to do my best to make sure that the entire surface is covered, because it does seem like it helps tremendously in the process. I believe this is something like how the plastic was laid in here previously. Every effort was made to limit where the moisture could be evaporating out of the bin. So we'll return it to the shelf just the way we found it. So 52 days. Man, I've never seen a bin look like this after only 52 days. And you saw why. It's because there's so many worms in here. And I also almost equally attest that to the plastic being here now. Because even if I had this many worms in one of my bins previously, I believe with the dryness that my bins tend to, or used to, exhibit, it would have kept the pace of the material getting broken down a little bit slower. These guys are just zooming. It's incredible. So let me get these guys back up on the shelf, and I'll get things cleaned up, as well as return this stuff into an active bin so the worms in there can continue feasting on it. But that's not very interesting. I'll save that for once the camera's been turned off. But before I shut that off, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate your company. I really look forward to your comments and input and everything else down in the comments. So be sure to write something if you have any questions or ideas. And be sure to come back. If you subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell. You'll be notified of new material coming online, and there's always new stuff coming online. If you enjoyed the video, I sure hope you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. It really means a lot, and I do appreciate it. And also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel as well. That's great too. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.